So I read the next 20 pages of the Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and so Gladwell introduces a new character to further prove his argument that that success is based is more reliant on factors such as opportunity, and then he disproves other more commonly understood factors that people think are that success completely relies on, and he proves how those factors are not as important as the factors that he's suggesting. And the first factor that he brought forth is opportunity, and in the previous chapters we're building up on this argument, and this chapter is doing the same. So he introduces this person by the name of Joseph Flom. So Joseph Flom is he passed away very recently. So uh, so he's a very successful lawyer. He was a very successful lawyer. He grew up in New York. He originally came from a Jewish family, and this is very important, as Gladwell later points out, that his Jewish roots is one of the main reasons that he becomes successful later in his life. So, from a very young age, he was interested in law. So he, after going to war, because he lived in the States, and he had to go to, because of the conscription, he had to go and fight in World War II. So he does that. He goes to World War II, fights, but he didn't actually see any action. He was in the background helping with with like armor and making sure that there's enough supply. So he wasn't really that big of a role during the war, which is good for him because this way he didn't receive any mental or physical injuries. So he comes back, and because of the GI Bill, he's able to go to Harvard, and he studies at Harvard. He finishes his education very successfully, and then he starts a partnership with a couple of other peers that graduate with him, and after a while he started a firm, and now that firm today, I think the name was let me check, Skadden Arps. That firm that he started with his partners today earns over $1 billion a year. So it's a very huge firm that he started, a law firm. So Malcolm Gladwell then breaks down his story after giving an introduction. He breaks down his story and looks at what makes this person more successful than others. Like I mentioned earlier, Gladwell first mentions that one of the main things that made him successful is his Jewish heritage, his faith, because at that time, because of anti-Semitism and so on, Jews were often persecuted. Not so explicitly in the States, and it wasn't as bad in the States as it was in, for example, Germany, but anti-Semitism was still there. So a Jewish lawyer back in the 30s and the 40s would not be hired, and even up until the 60s or the 70s would not be hired just because of his faith. So this made many Jewish people who are very talented, very well educated, not able to have jobs. So they were the underdogs of that society, and that's what Gladwell argues, that being the underdog gave them life skills which helped them become successful later on. And another thing that he argues is that Joe Flom was just there at the right time. He was born at the right time. He was born when his parents were going through the Depression, the Great Depression in the 30s, the Dirty 30s. So at that time, most people weren't having a lot of kids because of the Depression. So there were smaller classrooms, not so much competition. So he had more one-to-one time with his parents, with his teachers, and the effects of that carried on, and it led to more success in his future. And so that aspect of perfect timing comes in again. And also Gladwell gives an argument which is kind of counter to what he said in his previous in the previous passage that I read before this one. That people of a higher class tend to be more successful because they're in a more advantage situation when they're kids. But in this chapter, in this passage, Gladwell gives the counter as well, that many people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, because of their disadvantaged background, not in spite of them, they're successful, right? And this is the perfect example of Joe Flom. As a child, his parent, both of his parents worked in a fabric warehouse where his father would sew clothes for women's clothing. Uh, but because of that sort of a childhood where he saw that success is something that you have to work for, you have to earn, that gave him the right mindset to become more successful, to know that everything requires hard work. And I find this actually very interesting. That this is the story very interesting because uh, the story of the underdog, where he starts off, he comes from a disadvantaged place, but not just in spite of them, but because of the disadvantages, he becomes successful. This sort of an underdog story really appeals to me because uh, in a way I can kind of relate to that. And not saying that I'm completely disadvantaged compared to the rest of the world. I'm at a very great advantage, I would say. But uh, but there are always people who have that more of a successful childhood than I have, right? And to know that uh, just because someone was born to a wealthy business owner doesn't mean that they will be more successful than someone who is born in a middle class family, because success is so much more than that. And that's really reassuring to me, and this passage really appeals to me because of that. And it shows me that there's more to success than just the success of your parents.